All right, we're here with Justin Dunk and John Hodge of 3DownNation. I guess before we get into our big conversation about the XFL, CFL stuff, we'll start with you, Justin. Kind of give people like a background of what you kind of do, and then how did you get involved with 3DownNation?
I'll try to make the Coles Notes version very quickly. So I played football at the University of Guelph and then wanted to cover it after my career. So worked for The Score. That turned into a job with the Sportsnet. And then Drew Edwards, who initially started 3DownNation when he was covering the Hamilton Tiger Cats for the Hamilton Spectator, brought me on board in a part-time role. That's evolved into full-time. Now we're independent with my boy John Hodge on here. So that's what we do. We cover the CFL, break news, and I believe, I don't want to be arrogant about it, just confident that we're the best website in Canada in terms of covering the CFL day-to-day, breaking news, analysis, and insight. Obviously about football, it feels like we haven't talked about football in a long, long time.
Yeah, and John, what's your background with 3DownNation?
So Dunk is being modest. I mean, he was a star at the University of Guelph for his quarterback. And the extent of my playing football was about the age of 13. I realized that I sucked so much that if I wanted to stay in football, it was going to have to be not as a player. So I was a diehard Winnipeg Blue Bombers fan growing up. I'm from Winnipeg originally. I still live in Manitoba. And I launched my own brand covering the team independently in 2014. A year later, when 3DownNation was launched, we're just coming up on our 6th year anniversary. We launched May 4th, 2015.
Okay.
I joined the site, and I've basically just worked my way up, starting as, basically starting as somebody who was covering the team as a fan. And the last few years, I've been digging into it a lot more and really enjoying covering the league as a whole and getting involved in all kinds of publications, right? Whether it's print or whether it's podcast, video, all that stuff has been a blast. So I'm a CFL lifer and really, really honored to be part of the team at 3Down.
Oh, that's cool. And I was thinking, people are asking, I was like, well, 3DownNation is like the XFL News Hub version in Canada for the CFL. But then I'm like, well, actually, XFL News Hub is the 3DownNation version because you guys have been around doing your game for a lot longer than we started in 2018. And then you guys have been around ever since. You said now you're going on your 6-year anniversary, which is cool.
Yeah, I mean, probably a good comparison for people would be like we came along 15 years after Pro Football Talk. So we do kind of for the CFL what Pro Football Talk does largely for the NFL. And obviously you guys do that on the same scale, just for a different pro league.
Yeah. And then you guys have podcasts and great guests. I highly recommend checking out their podcast. I've listened to other CFL podcasts as this news broke 3 weeks ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed what you guys are doing. I mean, you guys are knocking it out of the park. And then we also have Mike Mitchell, and everybody knows Mike. Welcome to the back there, Mr. Mike.
No, thank you very much for having me. This is going to be a good discussion.
Yeah. All right. So what we wanted to do is, because people were tweeting me saying, hey, you need to get some CFL guys on. And so I think we have the perfect CFL guys on. So can you just kind of give us XFL American fans an idea? They understand that the third down and the fourth down, but there's a lot of other aspects of the CFL game that are different from what Americans are used to.
Yeah, so I'll hit on a couple and then I'll let John kind of pick up what I missed. But I feel like the other main ones that you're going to talk about is the size of the field and the width of it. It's much bigger. You have, ideally, if the stadium can fit it, a 20-yard end zone. So it doesn't get so compressed down there. It should promote more scoring and ideally more touchdowns. A yard off the line of scrimmage, the offensive lineman and the defensive lineman a yard apart. You have the waggle where, other than your wideouts, and you have to have your tackles, let's call it bookended. So you have to have one person on the line of scrimmage outside of your tackle. But other than them, there's slot receivers that can run around and go in motion and go sideways, do whatever the heck they want before the snap of the football. Ideally, you want to hit the line of scrimmage at full speed. Obviously, you have the extra player on the field, and there's many other nuances as well. I'll let John touch on a few of those.
Yeah, so in a base 12-man formation, I mean, Canadian football really does not utilize, or at least for the last 40 plus years, does not regularly utilize the tight end position. And that's almost a way in which the American game is kind of mirrored the Canadian game, right? Like when you think about the iconic tight ends in the NFL, whether you think about, Jimmy Graham, who kind of helped revolutionize that position, or Tony Gonzalez, or, more recently, a guy even like Hunter Henry, they can block, but that's not what they get paid the big bucks to do. They get paid the big bucks to line up in the slot and make guys hurt and make plays with their hands. And in Canada, your base formation, you've often got five receivers, two on the wideouts are on the line of scrimmage. As Dunk said, the slots are starting 8, 10, 12 yards back, using what we call the waggle to hit the line of scrimmage at full speed. And on the defensive side of the ball, you've got 6 guys who are part of the who are part of the base formation. You've got a free safety, you've got 2 slot corners. We call them nickelbacks in Canada. Then you've got 2 corners, and then the strong side linebacker position that in America you guys would call usually the nickel or the dime. We call strong side linebacker. So you've got a base formation of 5 receivers and 6 DBs. And I'll say, as Dunk said, when watching American football, I almost feel like it's claustrophobic, just as somebody who primarily came up on Canadian football. For Americans watching Canadian football, I'd imagine it's the complete opposite. It looks like, you've got all the room in the world, and it's almost agoraphobic, like you've got so much space. So there's a lot of shifts. I mean, at the end of the day, it is football, but there's a lot of changes in the nuances of the rules, certainly.
Yeah, because I was listening to. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, as an American football fan who loves the Canadian game, I do want to ask you guys this question. Has it ever been suggested moving the goalpost to the back of the end zone? Because I think personally, from an aesthetic reason and a safety reason, it would be really cool. I know the NFL, there was a time way back when where the NFL had the goalposts in front, then a league came along, the World Football League, and they followed suit and they moved those goalposts. I think one of the cool things about the CFL is the space, as you guys were mentioning, the width, obviously the length, the 20-yard end zones. I think on television, a 20-yard end zone with the goalposts at the back, my crazy opinion, sorry for the crazy American opinion, but I think it would be very cool. I think on TV would look better. It's a little cumbersome for Americans who watch a CFL game. They're going, wait a minute, as soon as you get to the goal line, there's these big goalposts standing right there. And it's like, why are they there? People didn't realize that the pro game, college game used to have the goalposts in front. So what do you think about that? Has that ever been suggested before, moving the goalposts towards the back end? I think, like I said, from a TV perspective, that would look cooler. Maybe that's just me.
The only time I really feel like it gets brought up is when somebody runs into the goalpost. But other than that, it honestly hasn't got talked about at league meetings. And Hodge well knows, and he can speak to this too, that every year they look at tweaks to the rules and what they should do. But the goalpost is one, at least recently, that hasn't been talked about.
Yeah, I think if you were to poll fans of the Saskatchewan Roughriders who had a ball, it was the West Final this past year in 2019, this past season, I guess I should say. Yeah, and occasionally a live ball will hit the uprights, in which case it's a dead play. And when the game's on the line, it is a bit anticlimactic for the ball to ring off the post. And and the play's dead. But other than that, it is a safety thing. It's been a long time since I can remember anybody careening into a goalpost, but it does happen, and the dead plays happen. So yeah, it has been part of the discussion lately, but it is certainly something that I could see the value in potentially.
And I'll just say real quick, offenses use it sometimes as their 13th man when they get down there. I know when I was playing in university, we used that as essentially a pick, right? Like in basketball, a pick on the defender, and there's no covering that guy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, here's another ignorant American suggestion. So everybody who's watching this who's Canadian, feel free to flame me. The Rouge, for any consideration, I was watching Toronto, it feels like 18 years ago. They're driving down the field, they're down by 1. Here comes their kicker. Oh, forgetting the gentleman's name. He shanked the kick, and they tied the game. So, as an American who watches football, I felt like sitting there going, okay, why is this team being rewarded? This guy, it's not like he attempted a 60-yard field goal and just missed the upright. He shanked it. I mean, it happens. I'm not trying to bag on the kicker. Hey, you could slip and all that, bad snap, whatever. But that's a rule that, I don't know if I understand that's sacrilegious to say that, but I think that's a rule, in my opinion, that teams shouldn't be rewarded for a shank kick when they're driving down the field. That's just my take on it. I'm sure you guys have maybe a different viewpoint, so I'm bracing for it. So go ahead.
So John, what is the Rouge? I've heard this term brought up, and I'm like, I don't even know what it is.
So a Rouge is a 1-point score that does not exist in American football. It does in Canadian football. I'm far from an expert on rugby, but my understanding is as the Canadian game evolved in the late 19th century and incorporating some obviously some rugby and carrying those rules over from Europe and incorporating some aspects of the American game, it stayed in Canada and we liked it. Now, it is true 100% that from time to time teams are rewarded with 1 point for missing a field goal. But essentially, because the end zones are so big in Canada, right? They're 65 yards across, they're 20 feet deep. The idea is that if you advance the football via a punt or field goal or kickoff into your opponent's end zone, they are required to bring it out. And so let's say you miss a kick. Well, in the NFL or XFL, you miss a kick, the ball's out of play, right? In the CFL, you've got 20 yards of real estate back there. So you'll often on field goals, especially long field goals, you'll see a return specialist in the end zone and they have the opportunity to catch the ball. And if they catch the ball and they bring it out, there's no score. If they keep it in the end zone, they fail to bring it back past the goal line, you will see a 1-point score. And essentially it's an incentive for the return team to bring the ball out. Now, oftentimes teams will say, hey, we got 110 yards in front of us. If the returner brings it out and they get tackled on the 2-yard line, it's not worth saving a point to have 108 yards to cover, right? And so there's some strategy there, some field goal there, or some field position consideration there. But that is the Rouge. It's a 1-point score. Essentially, if you kick the ball through your opponent's end zone or your opponent receives the ball in their own end zone and decides to take a knee instead of bringing it out.
Gotcha. Now, one of the things that, aside from the fans were talking about the rules, is that people started talking about, we're trying to figure out whether this is kind of like a merger, a hybrid kind of thing. And as the idea of games being played simultaneously, for example, fans in the US are like, well, you can play your games in April. And apparently you can't really play football games in April in Canada. Do I have that right, Justin?
You could in Toronto right now, man. It's beautiful, but Saskatchewan literally just got a dusting of snow a couple days ago after it was in the double digits. Hodge, what's it like for you in Winnipeg?
Yeah, so in the month of March, the province of Manitoba, which sits directly north of North Dakota, the average high over the course of the day is the freezing temperature, which is 0 degrees Celsius, and I think it's like 43 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know offhand. But it's the freezing point.
Mm-hmm.
So you could, in theory, you could have games in April. There's certainly some cold weather games in the CFL, with the CFL season not ending until late November with the Grey Cup. But in places like Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, you're going to have some miserable games if you're playing as early as March, even April. And the other catch, of course, is training camp. I mean, you could not have an outdoor training camp in Regina or in Winnipeg in February. February is still, like, you're talking minus probably 15, 20 degrees Fahrenheit, often with in many cases 18 or 24 inches of snow on the ground. So starting early, I'll put it this way, there's a reason the CFL doesn't start in March to begin with, and that's because it doesn't work very well with the conditions outside.
So usually it starts in May, is that right? Would April work? I mean, it wouldn't start. XFL wouldn't start in March either here because of college basketball.
Gotcha.
So is April a month that's kind of doable?
Maybe. I mean, traditionally the CFL opens its training camps May long weekend, and they like to kick off usually the second week of June. And the reason for that is that's traditionally where the Stanley Cup playoffs wrap up. Essentially, it obviously depends on how many games each round of the playoffs have. Sometimes we've seen the Stanley Cup, not handed out till June 15th, but that's pretty late for them. Sometimes the season is done by the end of May. Sometimes it sneaks into June, and that's where the CFL likes to pick up. Let's pick up that hockey audience, because the NHL is number 1 in Canada. The NFL is probably just squeaked into number 2, and CFL is a very close number 3. So if you can. Yes. So if you can sneak in there, then and the NFL I don't think is above the CFL in terms of Ratings, I think the CFL's average ratings are probably higher than the NFL still, but certainly among young people, we have seen a trend where more people under the age of 35 are watching NFL than CFL. At least that's what they're telling the pollsters. So I'm trying to back that up with data, and that's what the pollsters are saying.
Gotcha. And then the Grey Cup was the last Grey Cup. It was like -20 or something during the Grey Cup. Is that the last?
It gets chilly.
Is that how cold it was at the last Grey Cup in November?
I think it might have been -20 in our temperature, but I don't know what that would extrapolate over for you guys.
Oh, okay.
You know, here in the States, one of the big issues with spring pro football leagues is they've started in February, a week after the Super Bowl. And, you know, oftentimes fans of these types of leagues have requested that the teams be located in warmer locations. But, you know, a lot of these leagues have had teams in New York and Seattle and Chicago and et cetera. So there has been, you know, I guess in America we're accustomed to it. There have been games in February that have been in that 20 below, 30 below. And that's affected attendance too for startup leagues. I know for a fact, covering the New York Guardians, they had some pretty brutal games out there, you know, managed to cram 18, 20,000 fans in there, despite the fact that 20 below with snow flurries and all that. So I would guess, I'm not Canadian, but I would guess April and November are fairly, you know, maybe April's a little bit better than November, maybe, depending on where you're playing in Canada. So I think for football players, I think playing on March is no-go as far as I'm concerned. But I think April is somewhat doable. These football players are used to playing in cold, a lot of them, in cold weather and the elements and all that. It's not perfect or ideal. I suppose you can set up training camps in warmer locations if there are any in Canada. But yeah, that's, you know, I think April would be the thing John brought up is, you know, competing with the Stanley Cup or competing with the NHL during the playoffs. That, again, if you're going to do anything April-wise or what have you, or beyond, you're going to have to schedule your games where they're not directly competing. I would suppose that most Stanley Cup games, most Stanley Cup playoff games take place in the evening and prime time. So you'd have to have a lot of football in the afternoons, which is, you know, Americans are accustomed to. CFL, I know, is in the past has moved their games around, Friday games, Thursday games, etc. So you'd have to, if you're going to start a CFL season in April, you'd have to be a little bit creative on how you're going to schedule the game so you don't go head-to-head with the king that the NHL is in Canada.
Yeah, to be honest, in terms of the NHL, guys, unless a Canadian team is in there, and it's been a long time since a Canadian team even won a Stanley Cup, or should I say sniffed one, then the ratings tend to drop. Like the last Stanley Cup champion obviously was the Tampa Bay Lightning. It was a little different because it was a hub city, but it wasn't like those ratings were through the roof. So generally the NHL, you're right, likes to play in prime time, and they always focus, especially on the weekends, on Saturday night. That's hockey night in Canada through the regular season. And that's the gold standard for television up here. Is generally you put a Leafs game on, it doesn't matter who they're playing. Obviously this year it's always a Canadian team because of the North Division. You're going to get 1 million viewers. Now the Leafs are actually really good this year, so we've seen them peak up over and above that. I believe there's been some games that are well over 2 million viewers, but I think you could strategically place your games, as you said, on a Friday night, because they generally, unless the NHL Stanley Cup Championship Series fell, and that's where you had to play your game, was a Friday night, I don't think it would be that big of an issue, because you really would maybe only have one. The NHL would love to have 2 Canadian teams somehow in a Stanley Cup final. That won't happen this year, but in the future. So I don't think it's necessarily this behemoth that everyone's talking about.
Interesting. And then, so to take it back to when 3 weeks ago, when you guys heard this news about the XFL and CFL, I mean, our reaction was, oh, this seems kind of cool. In Canada, it opened up this whole host of worms between financial stuff and then, you know, the rules and all this other stuff. So what was the reaction in Canada?
Largely people were surprised overall, and I can only really speak for myself. I'll let Hodge have a take here in a second, but we'd heard some rumblings of this, you know, kind of like Mike had, and I was talking to him about this long phone conversation we had, almost 3 hours.
Yes.
But it was tricky to put your finger on it because people are telling you, well, they're talking, but it's like, what are they talking about? And we still aren't really sure about that. I mean, we'll get into that a little later in terms of piecing together some of the details, but I think largely the reaction up here was, why are we talking about partnering with a league that hasn't been able to sustain itself. Obviously, one season in 2001 and then plays 5 games in 2020. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic largely had to do with that season going down the drain. And Mike, you presented a bunch of intriguing television numbers for what the XFL was doing. But I think people get really protective of the Canadian game because they think it's going to be just like another big American company coming in, like let's say Walmart, and taking out that mom and pop shop down the street, which is their CFL that's been here for a number of years. And the Grey Cup's been awarded for over 100.
It's worrisome, no question about it. I don't want to see the Canadian game change, but I see some tweaks to it. I think the business model needs to be upgraded and updated. There's no doubt about it. And that's my opinion. I'm not saying that they're not in a position where they break even or they can be profitable now. I just think they need to create multiple revenue streams and get with the year 2021 and not be so gate and TV reliant. That's the old model. But anyway, I'll get into that momentarily. But yeah, it's tough. I understand from a Canadian perspective. You don't want to lose a lot of the great aspects of their game. And I personally would have a hard time, and I'm an American, would have a hard time with stripping away the CFL game. I could only imagine from a defensive standpoint, if you had to defend, let's just say they kept the CFL dimensions, 4 downs. So if you had 4 downs with the CFL dimensions, defenses are in big trouble. Scoring would skyrocket. They're already in trouble considering the width of the field, motion of receivers, all that stuff, the size of the end zone, everything else. But if you added an extra down, oh boy. So I know defensive players would vote against that immediately in Canada. But yeah, getting back to the original point, I'm an American and I'm saying this. I would have a hard time saying goodbye to the CFL traditions.
Gotcha.
I would have a hard time. I can see I'd probably be more accepting of some hybrid, like I mentioned, the crazy goalpost thing and the 1893 rugby Rouge rule. But I would, it's just me being silly, but I would be more accepting of some hybrid of the rules than I would be of stripping it completely away.
So John, what was your reaction when you started hearing all this?
I want to preface this by saying that I appreciate the XFL for what it is, and I understand it has a passionate fan base. And I don't want to sound closed-minded because at the end of the day, I want what's best for the CFL because I care about the CFL. I have for my entire life. And if this is something that could, bring the CFL to a new level, or as Mike said, change the business model, help cultivate a stronger foundation, then I want to look for the positive in that. That said, I hate this development with most of just to be completely honest with the last 3 weeks have not been pleasant for me. I feel like the CFL has done a very poor job of really indicating or proving that they need a buyout. Basically, Randy Ambrosie sat in front of the Canadian government, the House of Commons Finance Committee in May 2020 and said, "Hey, we need $150 million." And they said, "Okay, interesting. Can we see your books?" And he said, "Nope." And they said, "Okay, well, good luck finding your money elsewhere." That's the very, very Coles Notes version. And just for some background on the CFL's finances, and I acknowledge too that I live in a bit of a bubble. Again, the super Coles Notes version is, the CFL was all the rage in its big markets, Toronto, in BC, in Montreal in the late 70s, early 80s. And the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the Saskatchewan Roughriders on the prairies were like the little brothers. They needed help. There was gate equalization that helped keep those teams alive. There was even a time in the 90s when the Saskatchewan Roughriders had a telethon to keep their lights on. And that is completely flipped. Now we've got super strong markets on the prairies. The Saskatchewan Roughriders have an NFL caliber stadium. They do $40 million of revenue every year. And the big markets are in trouble. So the narrative seems to be, oh, well, the business model's broken. The CFL is dying. I mean, the league's been around officially since 1956. Professional football has been around in Canada since 1876. The way I look at it, and I've delved into some of the history, the CFL's business model, in my view, is not broken. Or at least if it is broken, it's been broken for 50 years, in which case that means it's been operating broken for decades.
Mhm.
So I tend to reject the notion. I'm highly skeptical of ways in which the XFL can make the CFL better. If the choice is the CFL dies or amalgamates with the XFL, I'm not going to suggest that the CFL should die. I have seen that sentiment around. I think it's in every poll I've seen, approximately 30% of CFL fans have said, if it's 4-down football, I'm gone, which I think is a huge red flag for anybody who wants to potentially, enhance revenue by merging these leagues or amalgamating them in some meaningful way. If the CFL is only viable right now because it has these hardcore fans in key markets, well, if they bounce, I don't know what you're getting out of a merger.
Right.
So I'm trying to keep an open mind, but I will admit my bias, and I will admit that looking at the numbers, I'm really struggling to see how it makes sense from a Canadian perspective. But as I said, trying to keep an open mind.
Right. Well, one of the things that I was thinking too was I'm starting to warm up with the Canadian rules, because I started thinking, I was like, well, I'd be really curious what the players think. Here are these guys that go to college, or their dreams are the NFL, or playing in college in Canada. I'd be curious what rules they would want. As a perspective that we didn't hear. But Mike, I wanted to get into what you were kind of talking to earlier, is that a lot of people put this on, well, The Rock wants this, and it's The Rock this, and he sends out a tweet, but really there's the main player behind this is really not The Rock and not Danny Garcia.
Right. I believe that Redbird Capital is being overlooked here. Everybody's focusing in on the name of the XFL. For those of you that didn't watch the XFL in 2020, there are a lot of things they did extremely right. Probably the best first-year startup league I've ever witnessed. So I'll say that. Get that out of the way. I understand I'm an advocate for it, but the rules, the inclusion, the game speed, a lot of similarities with the CFL game with a shorter play clock, even officials designated to spot the ball immediately, 25-second play clock. 3-minute warning in the CFL, very similar in the XFL, the comeback period. So there was a lot of great things they did. But I think people are looking at the name, the XFL, and they've got a negative feeling, a vibe, perception of it. They're also focusing in on The Rock, which I don't blame people for focusing on The Rock. He's one of the biggest celebrities on the planet. But the big factor in all of this is Redbird Capital Partners. And so, people are asking, why should the CFL do business with the XFL? They really should be asking, why should the CFL do business with Redbird Capital? And if you're doing research on Redbird Capital, along with LeBron James, they just purchased 11% stake in Fenway Sports Group, which is the Boston Red Sox. That's Liverpool. That's Nesson. That's several other assets there. They have partnerships with the Yankees, with the Dallas Cowboys, with the Yes Network, with Wasserman Media Group. They have over $4 billion in principal cash money put in to sports and other things. They're valued at $7 billion. So, and Redbird has a very evolved view in terms of sports business. And they're looking for multiple revenue streams. One of the problems, and it's not just a CFL thing, and sports leagues are learning this now. One of the problems with sports leagues, and they don't tend to follow their fans outside of the stadiums, meaning they don't monetize their customer base. A lot of these leagues and teams, what they do is they capitalize on the games themselves and when the fans are in the stadium for profits. They don't monetize their fans when they leave the stadium. Now, the Cowboys are very good at it. The Yankees are very good at it. What a surprise. They're valued as the most valuable sports franchises in the States here. Because they're ahead of the curve when it comes to streaming, when it comes to connecting with their fan bases outside of the games. So I think Redbird has that same type of vision in terms of monetizing their fan base year round. Now, you can't have a model where the only way you make profits, the games are important. You can't have a league without the games, obviously, but you can't have a model where you only profit from the games themselves and the TV deal. In 2021, this is even pre-pandemic, but now it's even heightened now. You have to have multiple revenue streams. And with the CFL or any league right now, and I would suggest with the CFL, I know there's some steps being taken in Canada right now, but gambling is huge. That's another thing the XFL did really well. At the beginning of their games telecast, for anybody who didn't watch, they put the point spread up there. The announcers talked about the point spread, the over-under. They did prop betting. They talked about over-unders on how many touchdowns or yards PJ Walker would have. It was a constant running theme. That's going to happen in every sports league. Give it a few years, maybe 10 years. Every sports league, they're going to start off games with the Spurs are favored by 3 over the Raptors or what have you. So fantasy, gambling, streaming, Redbird does a lot through the Yankees with Amazon. Obviously, The Rock has connections to NBC and HBO and all this. I think if you're looking at it from a CFL standpoint, if they're looking to evolve as a league, from a business standpoint, I'm not saying they can't survive. They've survived to this point. There are markets, as John mentioned, that thrive, contingent upon how well the team is doing win-wise. You see Toronto, some of these other teams fall on hard times and don't do as well. But it's not about surviving anymore. It's about thriving. Can you get the entire league to thrive? The only way you can do that moving forward as an entire sports league is if you create viable revenue streams, multiple. If you just rely on the gate itself and the TV money, which is decent, but not that much. CFL probably should get more than what they're currently getting from TSN. You're going to have issues. So a company like Redbird, now depending on where these talks go, you hear due diligence, you hear the crazy M word that everybody's scared of, merger, you hear letter of intent, all this stuff. They haven't reached that point yet. Depending on where this heads, I can't see where Redbird can't help. If they take some type of financial stake in the CFL, I can't see how they can't help the product, help its popularity, help its marketing, help its promotion. I can't see how Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson can't help the CFL. This guy has more of a followership than entire countries. So I mean, and that's just go look at the numbers. Yeah. So I can't see where those things now, we talk about the game rules and all that stuff. We got to get there first. I like the fact that John is saying, he's taking a wait and see approach. I get it. But from a business aspect, marketing, promotions, financing, everything else that I just mentioned, I can see why the CFL will listen and talk to Redbird. Look who they're dealing with. Look who they're operating with. The Cowboys, the Yankees, everything else I mentioned. They do business with the NFL, NFLPA, Major League Baseball PA. So I can see why they would talk to them and look for business solutions.
And that was all extremely well said. And you're absolutely right. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the Redbird connection, not so much the XFL. As you said, the XFL, from what I've read, that name is, it's probably something that would almost be a hindrance to a new league if these two leagues were to merge. You can't really call it the Canadian Football League if it's a merger, and calling it the XFL is probably not in their best interest either, because there's lots, there's tens, potentially hundreds of millions of Americans who have decided the XFL is garbage. I'm not watching it. It's folded twice. Now, is it their fault they folded the second time? No. Pandemic killed the league. Not their fault. But if it's about branding, you probably got to change it. I
will say this, they made great grounds. Like XFL supporters here had to defend the XFL product to NFL fans. I'm an NFL fan. I'm a college fan. And they had to defend the product so heavily, and people were swayed and convinced that the XFL was a great product. And there were a lot of people who came on board with it. Now, I know people will point to ratings and attendance and all that kind of stuff, but when you compare the XFL ratings-wise for a first-year league, why should the Dallas Renegades against the Houston Roughnecks beat out LeBron James on NBC in prime time? There should be no reason for any first-year startup league to what people consider no-name teams with no history and no-name players to even compete. And, I posted it all over social media. People question, well, what's this XFL guy doing? He's making up numbers out of his butt. These are numbers from Nielsen. These are direct numbers. I used to get numbers from the networks, market shares, and everything else. I know exactly, and anybody can go online and document it. The XFL on cable television was even their last game, which is arguably the best game. I beg any CFL fan to go watch it, right? Vipers versus Wildcats, the Sunday night primetime on ESPN. That was 6th out of 150 shows on cable. Now, most people will point to the viewership and say 833,000, that's nothing to brag about. But in America, with all the options you have for a first-year league that's supposedly down and out, ready to fold, For them to be 6th out of 150 cable shows for a first-year league is excellent. That's not bad. That's not folding. That's not falling on their ass and struggling to find an audience. That is excellent. And they're doing it ahead of other sports programming. They were competing with The Walking Dead and all these other network shows in America, and they're 6th. So I take a little bit of issue and get passionate about anyone characterizing the XFL on-field product or off as a bad product or a failed product. It wasn't. 38 players in the XFL are in the NFL right now. 80 former XFL players are on CFL rosters right now. I realize a lot of those players were in the CFL prior, but they played in the XFL. They're going to have an opportunity to make CFL rosters, even if the ratio works against them. But that's the quality of the league on and off was proven.
Yeah. And that's fair. I'll be honest. I didn't pay close enough attention when the XFL was on to really say one way or the other. The consensus that I read in general was the league is pretty good. The quarterbacks suck. That was the consensus that I saw. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's something that would change over time, right? Is you'd get better quality passers. And also, let's also be honest, there's lots of quarterbacks in the NFL who suck.
Right. We got to remember too, eight XFL teams, right? 4 of those quarterbacks are in the NFL right now.
There you go. And as long as
for a so-called garbage league, half of their starters are in the NFL right now.
Yeah, and as long as Nathan Peterman is under contract in the NFL, that means anybody can be under contract in the NFL.
No, but it speaks to, these aren't just guys off the street that are not good enough to be in the National Football League. PJ Walker is not a horrible player. Taylor Heineke, who went toe-to-toe with Tom Brady, is not a horrible player. Jordan Tiama was 2nd in the SEC in passing behind Tua. He's not a horrible player. He's on an NFL roster. Will these guys pan out as starters in the future? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know, but they're good enough to play in the league. That was the point. If they're good enough to be on an NFL roster, then they're quality players as far as I'm concerned, because only 1.6% of all college players make the National Football League. There are thousands of players that don't make it up here. That's why I'm an advocate for leagues like the CFL, the XFL, the Alliance of American Football, any other league that comes down the pipe.
Well, and I think and also like all the talking points that you've hit in terms of player talent, these are all conversations I've had with people about the CFL, right? We've seen time and time again, guys go down from the CFL to the NFL. If you want to use historical examples, Warren Moon would probably be the best one. Even recent examples, you've got guys like, Alex Singleton, who's, Oh, exactly. Right. Cameron Wake he could be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame for goodness sakes. Right. And these are guys who got looks very briefly in the NFL. One thing happened or didn't happen in their first training camp. They get cut. And without a CFL or an XFL or another place to go, then they go bag groceries somewhere, work in insurance. They do something completely different. When meanwhile, if they had the right opportunity at the right time, then they could be phenomenal players. One thing I do want to get back to, though, that I will 100% concede to you is the lens that I've looked at the CFL through with my entire life is, what can we do to make this league survive? And you use the word thrive. And that is something that is different. I had a conversation with first of all, I've had several conversations with people saying, he won't tell us what this is about, but our team president is the most excited I've ever seen him, because the guys who do the money are really excited about this potential, whatever it is, whether it's partnership, merger, we don't know. And the second thing is, I've never thought of the CFL as something that could be big internationally. If Americans want to watch, it's been on ESPN since 2014. That's fantastic. Obviously, you want to get some of that American money, and it's worth a lot more once you bring it over the border. The exchange rate works beautifully in Canada's advantage. But yeah, maybe the CFL could be a big moneyed interest. The challenge that I have as a lifelong CFL person is, okay, if we're gonna sell the CFL essentially to try to make owners a bunch of money, what are we giving up? Because if Redbird comes in 30 years from now, the CFL is worth 10 times what it once was, and it's got millions of viewers on both sides of the border. Yeah, I'm gonna have a hard time clutching my pearl necklace and saying, oh, they took my league away from me. But if in 5 years, let's say Redbird says, this was fun, but we're gone, I think that's the fear that a lot of Canadians have is, okay, we had 150 years of history in this thing and we sold it for a quick nickel after a pandemic that otherwise the league probably would have survived just fine. And now we got nothing.
Yeah, I understand those fears. I would say, I know you can't trust businesses and corporations. I get that part of it. I would look at Redbird's history of making investments. And I would say if they go all in on something, they're not planning on losing or bailing, or they see value. When they got in early on the Yes Network, they saw value in that. So they're in it for the long haul. They're in on Liverpool and everything else. They have a global view of sports as well and the value that it can have. So they're not a fly by night. Redbird is not a fly by night, flimsy company that's going to put money and every stock into something and just run away. I don't see it. I mean, it's possible. You can never trust business people, but they don't strike me as that type of firm investment group.
And one thing a topic that comes up is the rules and the rules changing. And I always go back to when the XFL was starting up and they were doing research and they were using the Spring League to do. One of the things they tried to do was the way that punts are done in the CFL, where there's a halo. And I was in a room with Oliver Luck and asking him about it. And one of the problems was that the NFL, the college players, they could not grasp to stay put before the guy caught the punt. And that was going to be a rule in the XFL, and they got rid of it. I assume that when they were going through this process, I mean, they took a whole year to make this rule book, and they definitely looked at the CFL. Like I would love to get like Sam Schwartzstein on or somebody and ask him, did you guys consider the 3-down rules? Because to me, I'm open to anything. Like, I think fans, I wonder sometimes if the XFL did some research, because Vince McMahon put in $200 million and they spent a lot of that before they even kicked the ball off on research. I mean, I have the football right here, the redesigned football, the whole deal. I'd be curious if they asked, if the XFL would have done 3 downs, if they thought it would have worked in the United States. Like, that's I'm all for it. I would go for it. But I would just be concerned that it would be a turnoff for the American fans, and then it would sag the XFL. And then, you know what I mean? Like that's a tough, and there's a lot of questions. And so we have, all these insiders here, starting with you, Justin. All right, it's been 3 weeks. And what are you kind of hearing? This is what fans really want to know, is what are you hearing right now? Are you hearing anything?
So to me, I hate using cliches, so I'll try to stay away from them. But this is clearly, and Mike and I think John would agree, and you too, Mark, much further along than just talking about talking. So in terms of the latest that I've heard, you have the stakeholders up in Canada that are all open to the idea. Across the CFL, I have not run into one person who is in a decision maker position that is staunchly against at least entirely going down the road and seeing what it could lead to. And I think they're very far down it. And you have high-ranking people that I've talked to in this country, respected business people in this country, that are saying that it would be smart, and even going so much as to say that there are people that cannot say anything in Canada because, and I get this sense, and this is just my opinion based on talking to these people, that they don't want to upset Redbird or The Rock or Danny Garcia or anybody involved on the XFL side. They don't want a leak coming from Canada. I think that's why the lips have been sealed. And I get the sense that when I talk to people, they say, I'm conflicted. I can't say very much. And to me, that points to some sort of an agreement, whether that's a non-disclosure agreement or something that they've signed to not let the cat out of the bag. So when I hear those types of things, often those get ignored. I'll give you an example. Recently, the league office sent a proposal to the Players Association for 2021. Well, the league made the players sign a non-disclosure agreement And then the league leaked the news because they want to control the narrative. But in this situation, everybody up in Canada is being very quiet because I believe they don't want to upset anyone down there. So that to me shows that it's very far down here. And I'll just flat out say it, that anybody with TSN is biased in covering what is going on here. I really believe that, and I'll flat out say it, and I haven't said this anywhere else, they're good guys. But Dave Naylor in particular, and to some extent Farhan Lalji, know more than what's going on here because TSN has such a major stake in football in this country. Yes, they pay $50 million for the TV rights for the CFL. They also have the NFL rights up here. They have the NCAA rights, and people would like to see U Sports covered more. There was some talk there that maybe the Vanier Cup, our university national championship, could end up at TSN. But they would love to have a bigger league, potentially, if they do pair up with the XFL, to go against Sportsnet, who's the major other sports media company in Canada that has the Toronto Blue Jays games on every night of the summer, pretty much, right? Baseball doesn't take anything off. So I think that's why there's so much at stake for TSN. And that's why those guys, admittedly, are biased and really can't say very much here. And I believe Naylor is doing the league's bidding here in getting people used to the idea of 4 downs and all of the things that are going to come along. That's just my opinion, but it's really the way that I see it. And that's how a lot of people around the league see it from the ones that I've talked to.
Interesting. So John, what about you? What are you kind of hearing?
Well, in terms of actual details as to what a merger could look like, I'm hearing very little details. I know, speaking of Dave Naylor, he floated on Twitter about a week ago that, it's reasonable to believe, I think was the wording that he said, that the CFL had signed non-disclosure agreements regarding their talks with the XFL. I spoke with somebody today who says they believe that to be a fact, that the CFL has signed non-disclosure agreements, which would explain why a lot of the details. Because I'll say this, the CFL is a very tight-knit community and very little stays secret in Canada for long. I mean, this is a league where, yeah, there's a lot of open secrets. There's a league where,
especially on a 3-down, right? We get all the scoops.
Well, yeah, 3-down is 3-down. Exactly. 3-down. I mean, that's part of what we make our living doing is, the CFL doesn't, for example, and between the league and the Players Association, they don't disclose any player contracts. Well, 3DownNation has developed a nice reputation for being the place to go if you want to know what a contract is like. It's only in the last couple of years that some teams are even willing to report how long a contract is. Oh, it's a 2-year extension versus a 3 or a 1, etc. So the details are scarce. I don't think, and I've looked at all the scenarios, I've talked them through with people. I don't think that an American League, National League baseball model would work for the Canadian Football League and the XFL for a number of reasons. Primarily is I just think that the games are too different. In Canada, with the extra space that players have to cover, we have a lot of 220-pound linebackers. We have a lot of 265-pound defensive tackles. We have a lot of, our reigning most outstanding player in Canada, Brandon Banks, who used to play for the Washington football team. He's the same size as my sister. I mean, the guy is 5'5" on a good day, and he probably weighs 155 pounds soaking wet. Now, he's a tremendous football player, and the fact that he is that small is irrelevant to his on-field production. But I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that there are some physical differences between how the games are played. Like, there are no Canadian football offensive linemen over 330 pounds, at least not listed. And I would actually believe that there's probably nobody over 350. Some guys play as low as 285 or 290 on the offensive line. In American football, that would be unthinkable. So if the idea is, the Tampa Bay Vipers are going to play in Edmonton on Friday, and then the following week, Edmonton is go down and they're going to play the Houston Roughnecks. It's like, okay, so you're going to have, 250-pound interior linebackers trying to cover 25 yards in either direction on a Canadian field, which just doesn't happen. Those guys just don't run well enough. And then the following week for Edmonton, you're going to have a 218-pound middle linebacker with a 260-pound tailback coming up his like it just doesn't work on a week-to-week basis. Now, if you just looked at it and said, okay, we're going to treat these like the old school AL-NL where they never really play each other except for the World Series, maybe that works. But now we're living in a world where it's like, okay, what is the point of this deal anyways if all we're getting is one extra game at the end of the year between the XFL and the CFL? And hey, if Redbird Capital, who know a lot more about the sports business than me, think that's worth it, then God bless them. That sounds great. But there's a lot of obstacles in terms of how the logistics could look, how the leagues operate, even just getting things as basic as their seasons, right? Is it really in the best interest of Canada to start their season in April and finish in September when October and November has traditionally been the CFL's money-making time? It's been a conversation. I'll say this. It's been a conversation for years that they should bump up the schedule to avoid the cold weather in November. TSN doesn't want to do it because their ad revenue getting closer to the holiday season.
It's true.
So, so now you're looking at taking the big money-making months out. You're looking at competing against the NHL more. Early season attendance outdoors. And by the way, 8 of 9 CFL buildings are outdoor facilities. The only one with a roof is Vancouver, which has the best weather anyways. So I have some big questions as to how anything other than a full-blown merger could work. And I still have reservations, of course, about a full-blown merger, just from a logistics perspective and how Canadian football has functioned and operated for 150 years. But that's what I'm thinking is I know for a fact that there is NDAs that have been signed for the Canadian Football League, which is why word is not leaked. And outside of a full-blown merger, I don't think that these two leagues, this is just my opinion, can operate as truly individual entities. I think the only way it could work is a merger.
And I'll say real quick, and I don't want to cut Mike off, but I just think this is important. Last year, and John sort of mentioned it earlier, but what it really came down to was the CFL asking for a $30 million interest-free loan from the government to get on the field and play in a hub city in Winnipeg. The government said no. We broke that story at 3DownNation, which effectively ended the season. So we have an idea now going forward, and this has been talked about with people I've talked to around the league, that they need money to get on the field. And to me, this isn't being talked about enough, that if the CFL plays in 2021, if the owners were not willing to fund a shortened season, which I guess would have cost them, let's say, that extra $30 million, then why are they going to be willing to fund on their own, potentially, and I don't think it's going to happen, but a longer season, let's say, because they were talking about an 8-10 game schedule. So we know that they need another financial partner to get on the field. So what I'm saying here, based on the people that I've talked to, if they're playing football in 2021, in my mind, and what I'm led to believe from the people I've talked to, it's because there's that financial component from Redbird. And no one wants to admit it up here, but silence is sometimes deafening, guys. And I'll go a little further. Roger Goodell was asked on a conference call recently at the owners' meetings about the CFL XFL partnership, and if that's part of the reason why all of a sudden, on the same day, guys, the NFL announces an extra regular season game, they go to a length to talk about their international strategy, and for the first time in a while, include the word Canada in their press release. To me, that is significant.
Interesting. Mike, so what are you hearing? What's the latest in the American side? But that is some interesting stuff. I didn't.
Yeah, definitely. Justin and John hit on everything there. There are NDAs in place. I've reached out to people up north, people I know. People are not allowed to talk right now. Now, whether or not things leak out, we'll see. As far as and those are definitely in place. And Naylor was very strategic in how he worded that. He can't blatantly come out and say it. He has to frame it in such a way. But that's exactly what's in place right now is NDAs on that side. Justin hit on it as well. CFL is going to have trouble getting on the field, not just because of the pandemic, because they feel they need finances to be able to make a season work. And that's where, follow the money, that's where Redbird comes in. Mm-hmm. But everybody's very tight-lipped right now. For all the reasons that we mentioned in terms of figuring it out, I know a lot was made about the Rock's comment about smart season. which was really in reference to the XFL because President of Football Canada, Jim Mullen, said that he had heard that Dwayne Johnson said that they would do all types of seasons during the year, and Dwayne never said that. Mm-hmm. So that's why Dwayne Johnson stepped in and said, whatever we do, it's going to be with the athletes in mind. We wouldn't do any kind of crazy, whatever, 10-month season or 2-3 different seasons a year. But a lot of the things Justin and John hit on are accurate. The NBA, the financial aspect of the CFL needing to get on the field in 2021. If they do get on the field, it could very well be because Redbird helped them do that. It's going to be interesting to see, they haven't figured it out yet. Everything I've heard is they haven't, because there's so many moving parts. It sounds crazy. They are far along in the talks for sure. They've gotten past the stage of what can I do for you? What can you do for me? Now it's figuring out what they're going to do together when it eventually happens. What I keep hearing from people, even though my crazy mind would love an XFL champion versus a Grey Cup champion, at least in the early going to test the waters, I keep hearing, and I don't want to believe it, but I keep hearing same league, same rules, same league, same rules.
Interesting.
And that's what I keep hearing. Now, what that entails, I don't know. Now, we'll see. That's scary for a lot of people on both sides of it. I want to mention this about the players for a second. There are a lot of the CFL has great players. They have the quality of play is excellent. So I'm not in any way trying to be negative towards the CFL. But a lot of American-born players choose to not go play in Canada because of the style of play, one, because of the money, and the living situation. Fine, I'm not saying CFL players aren't paid well. The third aspect is the style of game and whether it translates to the NFL. They're used to playing the NFL in college style. And a lot of American players say, I want to go live in Canada. I want to make that X amount of money. And they have a difficult time making CFL teams because they have to adjust to that game and the ratio, which I like. It's like a territorial system thing. I like when the AAF had a territorial draft for the American teams. A lot of American players won't go play in the CFL. The CFL, I would still keep the ratio. I'm not saying they should change that, but a lot of American players won't go play in the CFL. It kind of limits the quality of players that will come play for you because they don't feel like the CFL is a true transition into developing into being an NFL player. Now, for someone like me, I believe that any American-born player who goes and plays in the CFL and is a great quarterback, to me, that translates to being a great NFL quarterback. I know people look at me like I'm crazy. That's fine. I think Bo Levi Mitchell can play in the NFL. You call me nuts. But that's my opinion. I think it's harder to play quarterback in the CFL. A lot of American quarterbacks have learned the hard way, going over there and trying to succeed. So I feel like it limits. I'm not saying that the CFL should get rid of 3 downs and everything else, but I'm saying their style of play limits a little bit some of the American players that would consider playing for them. That's why a lot of the guys that are currently on CFL rosters that were in the XFL, the 80 players right now. They wanted to go to the XFL, like the SJ Greens and all these guys, Derek Dennis and all these great players. They wanted to go to go play in the XFL because they wanted to play in the States. They want to play the NFL style. They feel like that's a better bridge to getting into the NFL. And if the XFL had stayed viable, I think over time they would have taken some more CFL players over the course of time, obviously the pandemic and everything else, because a lot of players would have started opting to go. Maybe not quarterbacks because they're paid a lot. Although in the XFL, they weren't quarterbacks who were paid 6 figures. But these are some of the things that are factors in drawing in players. I think you can sell the CFL style game in America better if you have The Rock pushing it here. So maybe more players would just go, let's try it here in the States if they were to play Canadian style. I don't know if it's headed that way. I'm for it. I just don't know how that's going to go over. But these are definitely a lot of different factors, and it's why these leagues are not prepared to announce anything. The CFL side, their owners, a lot of them, quite a few of those owners have failed their own league because they haven't done a great job of creating multiple revenue streams. They failed their league. They don't know how to promote. They don't know how to market. They're stuck in 1993. They've got like a 1993 business model where all they think about is we can only make money from the gate and from TV deals, and that's it. We don't know what else to do. So, and that's the CFL, whether or not they move forward with Redbird, and you can argue that they should. But whether or not they need to update, I'm not like they need to get to a point where they can thrive and evolve as a league from a business aspect. This is not the quality of play. This is not about the players. This is not about the quality of the product. I'm saying from a bit, if they want to last, they wouldn't need infusions from leagues or anyone else or loans if they felt comfortable with their financial standing.
So you mentioned it there, Mike, just real quick, if I can fit this in. Mike talked about the word sell. And I really believe that's what the announcement was about, is saying, hey, we're open for business. Put up the sign, say TV networks, corporations, corporate sponsorships, come at us. And I think that's the reason why, everybody wants to know what are the details, what's going on. Well, it's only been 3 weeks. So for them to put up the we're open for business sign and to expect that, millions of dollars of corporate sponsorships have already rolled in the door, or these big television contracts. And I believe it was either the XFL or the CFL that floated this idea of this story out there. I forget the individual's name, but from Octagon, that said, hey, the XFL and CFL together could get a $100 million TV contract. I believe the guy's name was Daniel Cohen, who's an expert in that space. To me, that's what's going on right now. So that's what's going to dictate what happens in the future, how much money could potentially come through the door. So I think that's why there's not as many details as people would like right now.
Gotcha. So let's wrap this up, because we could talk for hours, but I'm going to give you're going to be the Danny Garcia, Rock, Randy Ambrosi role. I'm going to give each one of you an opportunity to say, what would you do with the CFL, XFL things? We'll start with you, Justin. You're in charge. How do you make this work?
Whew. Well, I'm going to sort of put a couple things together here. I'm really on board with what my boy John has said in terms of the CFL revenue overall. When they play football, or when they last played football, the revenue that they brought in was in and around $200 to $240 million. So if that's a starting point for any league, great spot to be in. So I think if the CFL can sort of strip it down and maybe take some of what the XFL has done in terms of centralizing their scouting, then they can save some money there. And I also think they need to be more diligent in terms of the coaching hires that they've made. We've had a team like the Toronto Argos hire multiple coaches in the last few years and still be paying them out. Mark Trestman was making $675,000 not to coach for the Argos. And we're talking about a league that is obviously counting its pennies. So when you look at that in a nutshell, I think the CFL could make better financial decisions. Overall, I'm with Mike as well. I think it's smart for the CFL to look at Redbird Capital. And I do believe that's getting lost in all of this, that if they're invested in, as you said, the Cowboys, the Red Sox, the Yankees, LeBron James, Liverpool, some of the biggest sports names or sports franchises in the entire world, you want to be with those people. And I'll give you one example, and people talk about it, and I'm with you, Mike, in terms of how these owners have failed the CFL. They haven't marketed their game to be cool and sexy to the younger crowd. And I think that's what John is getting at, is that the business model isn't necessarily broken, but it's certainly broken in a pandemic when you can't have people into the stadiums. And I think it needs to be revolutionized. So the one that hits home most for me is the We the North campaign that the Toronto Raptors came up with. Yes, they're based in Toronto, but that campaign, we're talking about basketball, which is played inside, but their We the North campaign, I dare say, took over the country. And when you go down to pre-pandemic, obviously, and hopefully it happens post-pandemic, to Jurassic Park, they call it in Toronto. You guys have probably seen it on TV down there. LeBron James has talked about it when he played here in the playoffs. It is electric around Scotiabank Arena. Inside is packed, but outside, and yes, winning the title helped, but even leading up to that, you had tens of thousands of fans packed in the streets before the Raptors won a title. And I really believe that We the North campaign hit home with that younger demographic. It brought Canadians together. The CFL, I dare say, has not had a campaign like that since they went radically Canadian, or Our Balls Are Bigger. And that was in the mid-90s. So I think Mike is bang on with that. They haven't invested in marketing, specifically in BC. As good as David Braley was in terms of keeping two teams afloat at the same time when he owned the Lions and the Argos, he didn't market and he didn't invest. So I think if you take the positives that the league already has going now and you bring in a financial backer like Redbird Capital with some smart forward-thinking ideas, then you get the best of both worlds, what Redbird's thinking, what works well in Canada, and hopefully it's a long-term viable league.
All right, John, what about you? I gave you the keys. Now you can create the league. What is it going to look like?
To me, and maybe this isn't answering the question properly, but what I would do from a Canadian perspective is I would look at the best practices that the XFL had to offer, because I think the XFL's marketing was great. I think they did a good job at appealing to a younger crowd, and I would rip them all off without giving them any credit and sell it as my own vision, because that's what businesses do. They find what's working elsewhere and they implement it. I'll say this, the CFL works great in 6 of its current markets. The Montreal Alouettes seem to be rounding the corner, and the narrative that seems to be pushed up in Canada, and I think certainly in areas of the United States, is, oh, well, the CFL is just not financially viable. And the comparison I would say is, well, if you had 9 people go on a diet and 6 or 7 lost a bunch of weight, you wouldn't look at it and say, oh, the diet doesn't work, because you still got a couple people who haven't lost any weight. What you'd say is, wow, those people must have done the diet wrong. And that's what's happening right now. Dunk is absolutely right. Toronto and BC have done a terrible job of marketing those teams. And I would almost argue that MLSE, which, by the way, is worth 5 billion Canadian dollars, with owning, organizations like the Toronto Maple Leafs, which is the most valuable franchise in Canada, certainly from an NHL perspective. I think the Raptors might be ahead of them now on a global perspective, but guess what? They own the Toronto Raptors too. So right now, the Toronto Argonauts are just a little tiny footnote on MLS's expense sheet. And when they lose a few $1 million, that just really helps them out at tax time. So I would almost argue MLSC is not even not only are they not putting in a full effort in terms of building the Argonauts and helping to make them successful, they're almost a detriment to the Argos. They're just kind of saying, hey, if somebody wants to buy a ticket to the game, they can. If somebody wants to watch it on TV, they can. Ultimately for us, it's a footnote. It's a tiny little portion of what we do. So optimally, if you were the CFL and I was in charge, I would say, let's steal the great ideas that the XFL had and let's stay a Canadian league. And are we ever going to be the NFL? No. But guess what? Toronto's never going to be New York City. And that doesn't mean that Toronto's not great. And the same is true to make other regional, perspectives. Well, is Amsterdam ever going to be Paris? No, but it can be the greatest Amsterdam that Amsterdam can be. And maybe that's me thinking too small. Maybe that's me saying, maybe I don't have the same vision that Redbird has. And if Redbird is an organization that can quadruple or better yet, turn the CFL into a money-making, globally known brand, then I'm just guilty of thinking too small. But for me as a Canadian, a proud Canadian, not disrespecting the NFL or the XFL, in my view, we consume so much American media and we're influenced so strongly by American culture. I would say, and I, by the way, I have many American family members. I don't hate Americans, but what I would say is keep your hands off our league and go home. That's what I would say. But they also have not hired me to run the league, probably for good reason.
All right, Mike, what do you think? If you're given the keys to the kingdom?
If I was given the keys to the kingdom, I would do business together, but I wouldn't radically make any changes to the CFL. I would keep them. I know it sounds crazy. It's a pipe dream. I would keep both leagues separate and have them work together. That's the way I would handle it. The way I think it's headed is a totally different thing. John and Justin hit on a lot of the key points now, with the CFL, the way it's structured, the business. I think Toronto, by the way, now perhaps this will age poorly, and it's contingent upon how well Arbuckle plays and their quarterback play. But I think I saw the power rankings, by the way. I think Toronto has a chance to be a worst to first kind of situation there. I know that they technically were, the last season they played, playing the Red Blacks helped them beef up their win total. But I think Toronto can be a factor if they get good quarterback play. So I think and I believe in pinball. So call me crazy. But anyhow, I can't wait till the CFL gets back on the field. I love their brand of play. I think there are aspects of their league that they really need to get with the current century. in terms of business and everything else. I think that goes all around. And so I think Redbird can help. I think both leagues if they work together, whatever it ends up being, I think they can make each other better. I think the XFL had a lot of potential. It's a shame it ended the way it ended. I think it was going to be the league that made it. Of all the leagues that failed, I think it was going to be the league that made it. So, and that's what Danny saw. That's what Dwayne saw, because Danny was a huge fan of it. And that's what Redbird saw. And they got it for a song and a prayer for $15 million. They saw that there was a market for it because Americans love football. I mean, right now, all I can think about is Kyle Pitts and Justin Fields and everything else that's going on in the NFL. And there's no games going on. So we love football here in the States, and I know you guys love football in Canada. So I'm hoping that it makes both leagues better. I'm a little bit scared about where it could head. So I'm a little trepidation about, part of me feels like we might be seeing American style football in Canada. So hopefully I'm wrong.
Gotcha.
Mark, somebody's got to ask you though, man. If somebody's giving you all of the power here, all that Redbird Capital, $4 billion. What are you doing?
I'm just moving to Hawaii, and that's it. I'll just keep it.
I'm
getting a nice part. No, I'm one of the few. I'm in the minority when I think it's going to be some type of hybrid thing. It's too difficult to merge these two together with two completely different cultures and just the weather in general. Just that factor alone, you can't play a season together. And, there's the hockey aspect of it in Canada. There's the NFL and college football thing. What I think you could do is, potentially play a couple games, against each other during that sweet spot during the summer. The XFL season goes until August. And then, the XFL teams go and have their playoffs, and then they have their best team play the CFL team in that July month, where you have flex scheduling or something going on in the CFL. So they're taking off and still playing games. And then the CFL can run its course and go to November and still have their Grey Cup. I just don't see it possible that you could stop the CFL season in August, you know what I mean? And then play for the Grey Cup. And there could be two American teams playing for the Grey Cup. Like, I just don't see how all that would go. So I think the only way you could do it, at least initially, is you play the CFL plays its season this year, same rules, everything, whatever. Next year, you maybe throw out maybe some new rules, that kind of thing. Nothing major, perhaps. Who knows? Because from what Mike, you've been hearing, and you wrote a big article, a lot of people talked about it, that the 2022 XFL season doesn't seem like that's happening. And then you roll into 2023. I think they need to play with this for a while before there's any kind of full-blown merger. And I've always said this from the beginning. If it's a full-blown merger, then yeah, the CFL books were really bad. If it's kind of a hybrid thing, then the CFL's books are not as bad as people are making out to be. And it's just kind of, they are actually legitimately just kind of helping each other. And that's kind of, but you guys keep hearing the whole merger thing. So, but who knows? And I'm all for it. I'm super excited. The fans on XFL News Hub and on XFL Markcast and Mike's been on shows, and, we are super excited to even just watch the CFL.
What I'm excited about, Mark, is I want people to sample the CFL game. God willing, they get on the field. Because I know a lot of people on the American side now are going to be watching the CFL more. It's like, cool, I got buddies to watch it with now.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of our community, the XFL community, is dying, itching to watch CFL games now. They're really into it. And I think a lot of people are going to fall in love with the game and the players and all that, the same way they were falling in love with the XFL last year. So that's the thing I really like about this, is the interconnectivity. And I think that's part of what Danny Garcia wants to do too, is like connect people from all cultures globally. So
and hey, Danny Garcia and The Rock, they're all smart. Maybe they're just like, hey, you know what? Let's just let the American fans really sample. And The Rock pumps, hey, check out the CFL this weekend, blah, blah, blah. Fans, you have a whole full season that gets used to those rules and like, hey, I kind of like this. And then in 2022, they say, well, we'll just keep the rules the same. You know what I mean? I don't think they're going to touch the rules at all, because if you were to say right now that you were going to change the rules, that's going to sabotage your 2021 season. Cause you're like you guys said, half the fans are going to be like, see ya. And the other half, you know what I mean? And be like, so that's, who knows, but it's going to be fun speculating. It's been a fun ride these last couple weeks, but again, I want to thank Justin Dunk, John Hodge from 3DownNation. Just go check them out, 3downnation.com. They got a podcast, just Google it or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course we got Mike Mitchell, our own Mike Mitchell on XFL News Hub. And thanks guys for joining on this chat. We'll definitely do it again as maybe the CFL season kicks off.
Oh yeah. Game to do it, boys.
Thanks, guys.